So hello and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's digital programming. I'm Ben Spagan and I'm a vice president at the Jefferson and am a contributing editor at the Erie Reader. Joining me in conversation is Dr. Andrew Roth, a scholar-in-residence at the Jefferson and no stranger to the Jefferson's digital programming and publications. Prior to this conversation, Dr. Roth has twice presented digitally on a topic he's covered extensively over the past few years at the Jefferson, and that is 1968. In June, we had a chance to compare 1968 to 2020, and learn about what history from 50 odd years ago stands to teach us about the moment we're living through right now. A month later in July, Dr. Roth returned to the digital programming to give us his overview presentation on 1968 titled The Far Side of the Moon and the Birth of the Culture Wars. His research into 1968, the year America shattered, as Smithsonian Magazine put it, led to another project, which is what we'll cover in this conversation here. The American Tapestry. We tell ourselves stories. A multi-part look at the American narrative, a new project for Dr. Roth that he's been exploring in various different ways. What is the story of America? Is there such a thing? Is there only one story or are there many stories? These are the questions we're going to wrestle with here in hopes of pinning down some answers. Now, a quick note on Dr. Roth. Prior to joining the Jefferson, Dr. Roth had an accomplished career in academia. From lecturing to leading, he taught in various courses before going on to serve in various administrations in Erie, and later on to lead Notre Dame College in Cleveland as its president, before retiring and being named President Emeritus. Breaking free from the tightening grip of retirement, Dr. Roth heeded the call to serve yet again and served as the interim president of St. Bonaventure University. Now, seeing his vulnerability when it comes to maintaining a relationship with retirement, we at the Jefferson wrangled him in, where he's been serving as a scholar-in-residence ever since, offering numerous lectures, producing plenty of publications, and facilitating the Ramey Fellowship Program. He's also begun hosting a radio show on WQLN Public Media. More on that to come later. Since this program is first airing live on the Jefferson's Facebook page, we're going to work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can as we host this event. If you have a question, just leave it in the comment section below, and we'll do our best to get to those. If you happen to be watching this as a later broadcast, please still feel free to send your questions and comments to us in the comment section on the Facebook page, and we'll do our best to get them along to Dr. Roth. And of course, for more information on both past and upcoming Jefferson Educational Society programs and publications, please do visit our website, jeserie.org, and be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Dr. Andrew Roth, thank you for joining us for this discussion.
Glad to be here, Ben. Always glad to help the Jefferson.
So Andy, as you're queuing up the presentation here, I think that maybe it's best to start, as they often say, at the beginning. What is the American Tapestry Project?
Well, that's a good question because that'll be slide one, which should be up here momentarily. Let me get the screen swapped. And there we are. Okay. The American Tapestry Project. We tell ourselves stories. As you mentioned in the intro, Ben, this is an outgrowth, and we're going to end up coming back to it. In some ways, this is an outgrowth of the America in 1968 series. But what this is about is trying to say, or trying to discover, and having discovered, trying to tell the American story, or the story of America. And a number of historians argue, Joe Lepore says there is no story of America, but there are stories of America. Other people say there is a story of America. Heather Cox Richardson says it's the story of the ongoing struggle between oligarchy and equality. Other people have said it is other things. And so what this project is about is trying to determine what is the American story. And this is probably as good a place as any. I landed on the metaphor of a tapestry, and not a simple linear or simple straightforward narrative, but a tapestry because really it turns out the story of America is like a tapestry. It's woven of many threads. And those threads, some of them, and maybe just a slight exercise in pedantry here for a moment, if there's a weaver in the audience, they'll know what I'm talking about. And if I get the threads reversed, I apologize in advance. But a weaving consists of warp threads and weft threads. The warp threads, if you happen to be sitting at a loom, would be the ones that would be vertical. in front of you, and the weft threads would be the ones that the shuttle brings across horizontally. And in a in an ordinary weaving, both the warp and the weft are visible. But in a tapestry, the warp threads are hidden because they are covered over by the weft threads, which create the visual depictions of the story. Okay, that's enough on weaving. And again, my apologies to any weaver who's listening if I've either oversimplified that or botched it. But the idea of the American tapestry is there are warp threads, there are key elements to our story that are sometimes hidden, sometimes only partially hidden, and they hold together all of the weft threads, the many stories that collectively make up the story of America. So that's what the American Tapestry Project is.
So for that, Andy, pardon the pun, but let's untangle it for you. How did you get interested in taking on a project so dense, so complex that you have to look carefully at that cross pattern, at that weaving, and just what drew you here?
Well, partially it's just fools rush in and all of those old cliches about, you start down a path and you think this is fairly straightforward, and then you discover, oh, maybe this isn't quite so straightforward. This is very complicated, very complex, both complex and complicated. Again, not trying to be a pedant. Things that are complicated aren't necessarily intellectually hard, but things that are complex may not be complicated, but they can be very difficult to grasp. But anyways, whatever, that's almost that is borderline gibberish. But how I got into the American Tapestry Project is the American story is it's a direct outgrowth of the America in 1968 project. And we're going to mix our metaphors here for a minute. What was the main lesson from the American story, the America in 1968? The one macro takeaway, if you would be, according to Smithsonian, we got the audio. Or did you hear that? I heard it on my computer. A window smashing?
Yeah, I didn't, Andy, but for a second there, you broke up a little bit, so I think that was the audio interfering there, but
that must have been the audio. In any event, Smithsonian Magazine and the viewers and listeners who are familiar with the 68 series have heard this before, but in their February 2018 issue, that's the cover of it, Smithsonian Magazine said 1968 was the year America shattered. And the question is, what shattered? And what shattered is the American story. And so to unmix the metaphor, we'll substitute for the word shattered what frayed, what fragmented, what began to become unwoven or began to come apart, unraveled might be a better word, was the tapestry or the weaving that holds the American story together. And that leads to the question, or a series of questions: is there an American story? What is the American story? Is there an American story? Or are there multiple American stories? Why should there be an American story? And all of those questions set me on the path of trying to discover, is there an American story? Or are there multiple American stories? And thinking about, why should there be an American story?
And I think one of the follow-ups there that we have to ask early, Andy, is why is any of this important to us?
Well, there's two reasons, I think. One is America, and this is one of the major threads in the American story. And we think of ourselves as old. The Declaration of Independence, we're at about 244 years and counting. If we go back into colonial, and again, this is European American history, Native Americans would have a different take on this. Hispanic Americans might even have a different take on this, because the oldest American city is St. Augustine, Florida. So there is admittedly, right at the get-go, we discover a somewhat Northern European bias in the American story, or at least the way it's been told previously. We're going to come back to that and try to undo that bias if we can. But America, the United States of America, is largely an idea. It's not an ethnicity of blood and soil. And how do you communicate? How do you hold together a group of people with an idea? And the way you do that is, it's because humans are storytellers. why is any of this important is really because humans are storytellers. Humans, and this is beyond Americans, humans as storytellers, in fact, might be what defines humans as humans. For a long time, we thought of ourselves as the center of the universe, and Darwin kind of blew that up. And as we have learned more and more, we then have discovered that we're not the only hominid who has walked on planet Earth. And then we've discovered we're not the only Homo sapien who's walked on the Earth. We are Homo sapiens sapiens, and that there have been a number of humans, Neanderthals, et cetera, et cetera. And we started to try to figure out how we defined ourselves. And then we defined ourselves as tool makers. Well, we discovered other animals make tools. Birds build nests, chimps use tools and sticks. Then we began to define ourselves as the animal who spoke. In fact, there is even a book called The Ape Who Spoke, that we had language, only to discover, well, dolphins have language, whales have language, birds have language. And then we began more recently, in the last 150, 200 years, to begin to think of ourselves as storytellers. And to the extent that anyone can ever answer this question, we are probably the only species who have mastered the ability of creating fictional narratives and then using these narratives to make sense of our experience, and then using these narratives to organize our experience and how we function. Now, if there's a cultural anthropologist listening, much like as if there was a weaver listening, that's probably a too simplistic explanation. But what I'm saying in a minute and a half here, or 2 minutes, why this is important is, without getting into all the deep background about humans as storytellers and anthropology, and the fact that we can talk because we stood erect, and when we stood erect, our larynx dropped deeper into our throat, or into our throat, for lack of a better phrase. And that enabled us to modulate exhalations with a great deal more precision than other animals, so that we could create words. And then, I'm not going to give everybody a 2-minute lesson in linguistics here. But because we can do this, we have this incredible ability to create stories or narratives that explain ourselves to ourselves, explain our experience to ourselves, and then to use those stories. And I'm tempted to say almost magically, because there certainly is an element of magic or mystery to it. But to use these stories then to organize how we function. Yuval Harari in Homo Deus and in 21 Lessons for the 21st Century goes on at some great length about this. He maintains it's what enabled humans to separate themselves from the animal kingdom, is that our ability to create stories enabled us to be able to collaborate with much larger groups than in small bands of 50 to 100 people, but to actually collaborate across thousands, then tens of thousands. If not now, there's 330 million Americans. And it's our ability to create that collaboration by telling stories that weave those groups into whole entities. So why is this important, and what has it got to do with the American story? Well, American culture is a story, or it's a series of stories, or it's a set of interwoven stories, which I increasingly am coming to think that it's really a series of interwoven stories that creates a tapestry, and that it's not linear, and it certainly is all-inclusive. So tapestry or quilt. Joan Didion, I think, says it best in the justly famous opening paragraph of her book, The White Album, which you can, the source that's cited on the slide is her collected nonfiction, but this is actually the opening paragraph of her book, The White Album, which we talked about on 1968. It's probably the best book ever written about 1968. You don't read Joan Didion to get a Trivial Pursuit knowledge of who did what, where, and when. But if you want to get into the psychodynamic, the angst of the age, and try to understand the socio-cultural emotion of the age, you would read Didion's The White Album. Anyways, the very first paragraph speaks exactly to what we're just talking about. We tell ourselves stories in order to live, and I'm the one who emphasized that in bold. And Didion, who is a great stylist, continues, the princess is caged in the consulate. The man with the candy will lead the children into the sea. The naked woman on the ledge outside the window on the 16th floor is a victim of today, or the naked woman is an exhibitionist. And it'd be interesting to know which. We tell ourselves that it makes some difference whether the naked woman is about to commit a mortal sin, or is about to register a political protest, or is about to be, the Aristophanic view, we'll come back to that in a minute, snatched back to the human condition by the fireman in priest clothing just visible in the window behind her, the one smiling at the telephoto lens. We look for the sermon in the suicide, for the social or moral lesson in the murder of five. We interpret what we see, select the most workable of multiple choices. We live entirely, especially if we are writers, by the imposition of narrative line upon the disparate images, by the ideas with which we have learned to freeze the shifting phantasmagoria, which is our actual experience. We could probably spend the whole hour unpacking that paragraph, just unpacking that paragraph about humans are storytellers. We tell ourselves stories in order to live. We use storytelling to make sense of our experience. We build community by telling shared stories and by agreeing to accept those shared stories. One of the major things that has happened in American culture, certainly post-1968, is, and I think the next slide speaks to that. No, it doesn't, but we no longer agree on what stories. I mean, here as an example, and I'm not going to, parse the page for the people. These are some of the stories of America, from Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, to Walt Whitman's Singing of America, to Huckleberry Finn, to William Gaddis's In the Heart of the Country, Malcolm X, Moby Dick. All of these are different stories, and some of them are hagiographic in that they celebrate America. Others of them are critical. But what you get out of that collage, when you start to look at all of these different pieces of the American story, you begin to get a sense of the holistic story. And the question I'm interested in the American Tapestry, if all of these stories, and I'm moving the cursor across here, if these are the weft threads, what are the warp threads that hold all of these together, and try to make of it something that makes sense rather than just a lot of, well, Faulkner, a lot of sound and fury. And Faulkner, by the way, is a fellow who is being reconsidered in the current issue of The Atlantic. Drew Gilpin-Faust has an interesting column, an interesting article on what to do in the postmodern world with William Faulkner. So, how do we seek meaning? As Joan Didion says, we impose order upon our experience. We tell a story. What's a story? Well, it's a narrative. It has a plot, or maybe not in the postmodern world. It has an agon, which is a fancy word for conflict. Your hero, your central character, wants to accomplish something. He encounters foils or villains. Those villains or foils, the foil could be human or not, that seems to impede or inhibit his ability to accomplish whatever it is he wants. It has a moral or not, a theme. It attempts to tell us something. And people love stories, and the stories they love the most are about themselves, as, for example, Western Pennsylvania native Annie Dillard's An American Childhood. She grew up in Pittsburgh. She's most famous not for An American Childhood, but for the book listed here at the bottom, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. So that's a pretty simplistic, and for the literary scholars in the audience, pretty simple explanation of what a story is. But stories usually come in a couple of flavors. They're origin stories. They tell us where we came from. They tell us who we are. They tell us how we ought to live. Some of them tell us where we ought to be attending to go. They're teleological, fancy word. Now, what's really interesting along all these lines is, a slight sidebar, is who cares who killed Roger Ackroyd, Edmund Wilson's great anti-detective story essay. What accounts for our constant, continuing obsession with detective stories? Well, my argument would be that it ties back into, we tell our stories to make sense of our experience. It's because detective stories are moral tales. We love detective stories because they are moral tales. They have an opening. They usually have a gathering of some sort. Food is involved, feasting. All appears to be well. All's well in the world. And then something happens. A crime is committed or discovered, shattering the well-being of the opening scene. Chaos is loosed. You have a rising and falling action. The detective arrives, begins to attempt to make sense of the chaos by the application of logic, reason, and intuition. The detective is the avenging angel or the knight errant who banishes evil, restores order, reasserts the communal values, and brings peace. And then almost all detective stories end, and this is back to Joan Didion in the Aristophanic view, all detective stories end in the Aristophanic sense that there's a return to peace and order signified by a social gathering involving food and goodwill. Sometimes it ends with a marriage, either literal or metaphoric. Well, that's a very simple explanation of a detective story, but all stories in some way do that, or if they don't do that, they intentionally work against it. But using this, admittedly, I'm not going to say simple, but naive in the serious sense of the word naive, using this naive outline, what shattered, what frayed, what came unraveled, what we seem to not be able to do is work our way through the rising and falling action and come back to that peace and order where everything seems well. We are still in this era here where chaos is loosed. And that's because we no longer agree on the story. We no longer agree on the story of America, what that story means, who's included and who's excluded. And so the American Tapestry project is an attempt to go back and see if we can't reweave, if you will, or in some way find the warp threads that hold the weft threads together to find that common ground that will enable us to tame chaos and to experience the Aristophanic moment of well-being. A pedantic aside for the non-English majors in the audience or non-literary audience, Aristophanes was the great comic poet of the classical Greek world, and all classical comedies, actually much like a detective story, all classical comedies begin and end with feasting. And so the Aristophanic view is the positive, optimistic, anti-tragic view that there's a way to put this all back together and all will be well. And of course, that would be the fireman in priest clothing will snatch the young girl back from the ledge and everything will be restored. Well, what's happened with the American story in 1968, and it's not 1968, that just happens to be a good benchmark year, a good year to hang a hat on and work from. What shattered, what unraveled, what frayed was the American story, and we no longer agree on what it means to be an American. On a little more serious level, another kind of story is history. On another more serious level, another kind of story is history. Jill Lepore, who I mentioned earlier, a terrific, an outstanding, I'm not going to say she's the outstanding young, well, she's younger than me anyways, I don't know how old she is, but she is one of the outstanding young American historians. Jill Lepore says that history, which in the Greek, or the original word, means to inquire, to ask, but curiously enough for our purposes has the word story embedded in it. History is the art of making an argument about the past by telling a story accountable to evidence. We could spend a lot of time, and in a future episode of the American Tapestry project, both here at the Jefferson later this fall and on WQLN radio, we're going to spend some time talking about history. But history is the art of making an argument, which is not to create disruption, but to advance a thesis about the past by telling a story, because people listen to stories. One of the things that went wrong, I think, in American education in the last 50 years was that history stopped being taught as narrative and got taught as a series of what it could appear to be disconnected, discrete events where you memorize names and dates for standardized testing. And when you lost the narrative thread, you lost the thing that held it together. And Lepore makes an interesting argument, I can't remember which of her books it is, that when trained historians stop telling stories, that doesn't mean other people won't jump into the fray and tell those stories for you. So it's important that people who know how to do the research, that is, people who are willing to be accountable to the evidence, tell the story in a way that's memorable. And she is an outstanding storyteller. And you see that fraying both in the treatment of American history. These are some of the classic texts. That's Lepore's These Truths down here. But the first American history was Edward Bancroft's History of the Colonization of the United States, Francis Parkman's the French and the English in North America, Turner on the frontier. The point is, and I'm not going to go over every one of these images, all of these people are talking about American history, but they have different ways of telling it. They don't all agree with one another. In fact, they kind of, several of them vehemently disagree with one another, but the best of them understand they have to anchor their argument in data. They have to anchor their argument in evidence. That history is not something that just nerds like me are interested in. History is extremely important. And when the first time I did this at the Jefferson, I used this, that's a map of Wisconsin. There was a big fight going on in Wisconsin over secondary school history standards and whether or not teachers would teach that the United States is a republic or whether teachers would teach that it is a democracy. And that actually became politicized because the Republicans in the Wisconsin legislature wanted it taught as a republic, whereas the Democrats in the Wisconsin legislature wanted it taught as a democracy with a small d. Now that might sound like an exercise in pedantry, but actually are two very different things. It's actually a substantive issue. I didn't update this slide. I will when we do this again. I could go that this is not just these old guys in the background here, or this arcane, well, seemingly arcane, but not actually arcane, argument in Wisconsin politics last year. This is right down to today in tonight's news. There'll be some article or some soundbite today somewhere on social media or that about which statue just got toppled, which founder to be honored, which founder not to be honored. What was slavery like in the South? What's the redemption? The lost cause? Why are they taking down all the statues on Confederate Monument Row in Richmond? So this is as alive and up to the moment as the next newscast. And so the story that we tell is important because, as Joan Didion says, humans are storytellers. We tell ourselves stories to make sense of our experience. Our common experience is in the history we tell ourselves. And history tells you what? Tells us where we came from, who we are, how we got here, what we're doing here, and where we're going. Orwell in 1984, it actually was the state that said this, but it didn't, but it still means it's true. Orwell makes the comment that he who controls the past, he who controls the present controls the past, and he who controls the past controls the future. And that is absolutely true. Faulkner, to go back, said the past isn't dead, it's not even past. And all of that might have seemed arcane to people and esoteric until they turned on the evening news in the last 3 to 4, 6 months, in which issues that people thought, oh, that's dead and done with. No, it's not dead and done with. It's as alive as the 6 o'clock news tonight. And stories are important, as Kurt Vonnegut says. We are what we pretend to be, so we must be careful what we pretend to be. Vonnegut makes that comment in a novel, Mother Night, and I believe the main character's name was Howard W. Campbell. Howard W. Campbell was an American who was taken to Germany in the 1920s. His family moved to Germany in the plot. He is raised in Germany, but as a fluent speaker of English, he becomes sort of an Axis Sally or a Tokyo Rose. He becomes a propagandist on German radio, talking about defending Nazism. But of course, in his private little secret heart, he was a good, kind person. Well, Vonnegut makes the comment, we are what we pretend to be, so you better be careful about what you pretend to be. If you pretend to be a Nazi in your day job and what you do is act and behave like a Nazi, doesn't matter what you are in your private little secret self, you're a Nazi. And that's important because that ties back into Didion. The stories we tell are important. We're going to come back to Vonnegut in a minute.
And as we think about coming back to Vonnegut, Andy, I can't help but stop here and just ask, how did we get so frayed? You know, if we're looking at this as a tapestry, I think the one thing we can all agree on, and we might differ about how to tell our stories, what stories we choose to tell, and how we reflect on those we tell, what we tell in the future, and how we change it. But I think one thing we can agree upon is that the American tapestry, if we're to call it such, is frayed.
And the answer to that question, Ben, is what did this? We've all heard the expression, have consciously or unconsciously, wittingly or unwittingly participated in the culture wars. We've heard that. Well, the culture wars are really an argument about whose story. Whose story is the story of America? Pat Buchanan famously declared the culture wars at the 1992 Republican Convention when he said there is a religious war in America. There is a war in America, a culture war about what America is, what it will be, where America came from, what America is, and what America will become. It's a war about values. And 1968 is a good signpost for when that split, that disagreement first bubbled to the surface, if you will. When you talk about the culture wars and the world that Buchanan's talking about, what America was and is and what it will be, a war for the soul of America, in the background of that is sometimes something I call the way we never were. There's this notion about, in many ways, it is white bread America. There's this notion that there's an America out there that is America that has somehow gotten lost, that it has somehow disappeared, or it's being undone, or it's being undermined. A guy named Andrew Hartman, in a book entitled The Culture Wars, Andrew Hartman is a historian. He created, at least as a kind of straw man to use in the background to create some context, what he called normative Americans. Normative Americans valued hard work, thought America was the best nation in the history of the world, thought slavery and things like that were aberrations off on the side, not really germane, when in fact it might be one of the warp threads. They thought that sex was heterosexual sex between not consenting adults, between married adults, whether it was for recreation or procreation, could only occur between a man and a woman, a married man and a woman. That was the way it worked, and it was within marriage. And the simplest snapshot way to convey, and everybody has heard this, what Hartman's talking about normative Americans is it was a kind of yearning for the 1950s. And one of the weft threads, not warp threads, and one of the weft threads is that for most of us alive today, that interesting period of time between, say, 1945 and just arbitrarily pick a year, say 1974, maybe even 76, the election of Carter, is sometimes looked upon as the golden age of America. That was a time when it seemed, particularly from 45 to say 67, 68, 66, 67, when there was a kind of consensus. There was unprecedented prosperity for the first time. The middle class burgeoned, and it was dominated with, the Donna Reed show, the nuclear family, Father Knows Best, Pillow Talk. There were poor people, but they were kind of funny people. They were Cramden and Carney. And there were black people, but they were kind of in the background. They weren't in the forefront. And you had Ike and Mamie, and it was the moment of American hegemony, I guess you could say, if you wanted to use a fancy word. And of course, as Stephanie Coontz, in a book kind of obscured here, I see on the screen in Zoom, The Way We Never Were, Stephanie Coontz points out that was a brief moment in time. And even then, there were things in the background. The Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, the Montgomery bus boycott in 1956. There was a foreign war going, a foreign skirmish going off in some exotic location in Southeast Asia on the fringe of awareness people. It wasn't exactly the happy time that memory, or maybe more accurately, nostalgia has encapsulated it in amber. So what has happened when we go back to Pat, what Pat's talking about and Pat Buchanan is talking about is that world, the world of the 1950s, has come unraveled. And there's now a struggle between people who would like to go back to that time, or people who understand there are issues that need to be resolved so that we can all go together into the future. But the culture wars are really because we are no longer speaking the same language, no longer reading from the same book, and more to the point for what we're talking about, no longer telling each other the same story or stories. We no longer agree about what it means to be an American. So the American Tapestry project is about trying to figure out what are the threads that make the American story, and how can those threads be woven or rewoven together into a coherent and unifying whole. Because as Vonnegut said, to go back to Vonnegut, why all of this is important, and I'm kind of paraphrasing this, we are the stories we tell, so we must be careful with stories we tell to others and to ourselves. We need to see if we can't get everyone singing from the same hymn book, which is what hopefully the American Tapestry will in some ways be.
And I think that as we're going through this as an overview and laying that foundation for the discussions to come, Andy, can you run us through what the major threads are? So we start to get a sense of that and then can anticipate how you're going to unpack each one of those when we look at this as a series in the fall.
Okay, I'm looking at the time, and we've got, let's see if we can do that quickly. I do have a slide on it. Here is my take. This is Roth's take on the American Tapestry, the warp threads and the weft threads. I think the warp thread, the most important warp thread, is the idea of America, the idea of liberty, equality, and opportunity. Joe Lepore, who I mentioned earlier, says the warp thread is the ongoing attempt, the ongoing experiment in self-government. Heather Cox Richardson says the warp thread is the ongoing struggle between the forces of oligarchy and the forces of equality. My argument would be it's all of that. It's not the idea of America, liberty, equality, and opportunity. Americans have been trying from the very, very beginning to do several things. And we have learned periodically in our history that they don't actually all work together very well. We are trying to build a culture based on the values of liberty, equality, and opportunity. We are trying to create a government that governs itself of the people, by the people, for the people, while at the same time trying to absorb and to bring together into a people, diverse peoples from all over the world. And I'm intentionally avoiding some cliched metaphors for that. But we're trying to do these three things simultaneously. And it says, and I think then we shouldn't be surprised that from time to time we bang our heads against the wall, we scuff our knee, or we actually start banging other people's heads against the wall. That, God, what would be actually miraculous would be if there were no conflict. It would be incredible if there were no conflict. So those are what I call the warp threads. The weft threads then are freedom's story, at home and abroad, self-government, of the people, by the people, for the people, the constant balancing act between individual rights and the common good. Freedom's fault lines, and in American history, freedom's fault lines are race and gender. And the most important theme that comes out of freedom's fault lines is that those freedom's fault lines is the ongoing struggle in America between who's included and who's excluded. The Naturalization Act of 1790 restricted citizenship to free white people. Ever since then, we've been expanding that definition. But there are those who would restrict it or constrain it, and those who have been excluded have fought to be included. What's interesting about that, we'll discover, is those who have been excluded, when they fight and argue for their inclusion, they appeal to the American notions of freedom, liberty, equality, and opportunity. They appeal to the American creed, the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. Those who would exclude them, most notoriously the Southern secessionists during the Civil War, would deny the American creed, flat out say it's wrong, as Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, did. Simply said it's wrong, we don't believe in that. Reject the Declaration of Independence. And so that's an interesting role reversal, if you would. Those who have been excluded fight for their inclusion by appealing to America's foundational values. Those who would exclude them reject the foundational values. And how each of those groups tell their stories is incredibly interesting. Another thread is what I call Hamiltonian economics versus Jeffersonian agrarianism. We'll come back to that in a moment. Might call this section the American dream, the dream of opportunity, success stories, can-do people, Horatio Alger, people who lift themselves up by their bootstraps, a nation of hustlers. I have the word hustler in quotes that, you know, the hedging quotes, because hustlers in both sense of the word, hardworking, can-do people, but also some people, not all of the people, some people willing to cut a corner or two, to hustle in the pejorative sense. And then there's the immigrant's tale. We are a country made up of people from all over the world, of every type. And then what I would say is the ultimate warp thread that ties all this together is the fusion thread. How we have, over the course of our history, expanded an ever-expanding definition of the we in our founding documents. This ever-expanding, this ongoing expansion of that definition has not been uncontested. It has been contested at every step of the way by those who would exclude, and it has been contested by those who wanted to be included. So those are the major threads.
And Andy, I think you're spot on there, especially with the we. I can't help but think of in his documentary about the Statue of Liberty, Ken Burns asks James Baldwin about liberty and what it is to him, and they really unpack the different definition of what that means for a white person, Ken Burns, and what that means for a black person, James Baldwin. And I think that that's really the highlight here with we. And as we really set up what is going to be a series to take a look at each one of these threads, can you go through and just tell us a little bit more about each one? What do you mean when you say freedom at home and abroad? If that's okay, just a quick glance over each one to really to tee us up for what's to come.
Okay, and I'm watching the clock. I'm gonna sprint through these, and so some apologies to folks in advance, but hopefully this will be enough of a teaser that each of these sections will be an entire hour later in the fall and winter. Well, the first one is freedom's story at home and abroad. You know, our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence. Tom Paine said we have the power to begin the world over. The Constitution of the United States, we the people, the Bill of Rights, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the Civil Rights Amendments, Civil War Amendments, which some people say were the Second American Revolution. And there's an underside, but it has two sides, American exceptionalism, this notion that somehow what's happening on this continent is exceptional and it has applications to people everywhere. And that's Paine. We have the power to begin the world over again. But it's also Hamilton and Federalist #1. Whether or not the US Constitution was adopted, but was not only important to colonial Americans, but it perhaps had importance to mankind everywhere, because it begins to address the question, can human beings, can people govern themselves, or are they forever to be at the mercy of tyrannical power? I've used the phrase the American creed, and we're going to, in the episode on Freedom Story, we're going to unpack this. The American creed is the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. It's what Lincoln referred to at Gettysburg when he brought it back to life. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Already, we would have a correction. that all men are created equal. Today, we would say all people are created equal. They're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We'll unpack that and take a deeper look at what that means and how that has powered America. And again, American universalism, as I said, Tom Paine, we have it, the cause of America is in great measure the cause of all mankind. What is the American story? This is John Gass's famous painting, American Progress. And you look at this painting, he did it in 1876 for the centennial. This tells you one story. This tells you one story. Conspicuous by their absence, there are no African Americans, and the Native Americans are being pushed off the screen into the lower corner by the spirit of American progress just overwhelming them. That was how Americans looked at it 150 years ago. That story wouldn't fly today. It doesn't fly so easily today. We'll come back to that. Thread 2, freedom's fault lines. I'm going to go a little quickly. The indigenous people, the Native Americans, who were here first. Contrary to one of the myths, one of the stories we tell ourselves in order to live is that the continent was empty. It wasn't. It was actually, well, it wasn't densely populated like it is today. It was not by any stretch of the imagination empty. Some people would like to think that the story of Native Americans is, well, that's nice, that's history, but you know, whatever happened, that happened, they're gone. No, they're not. This lady down here is Kimberly Teehee. She is a member of the Cherokee tribe of Oklahoma, and part of the Treaty of New Echota, which set up Oklahoma as the Indian Territory on December 29th, 1835, which led to the Trail of Tears. I'm going quick, we're going to go over that in this session. Well, on August 2019, the Cherokee reminded the people of the United States that that treaty gave them a seat in Congress and they would now like to have it. And more importantly, just recently, they won a legal lawsuit which says, and the Supreme Court upheld it, and I believe it was Justice Gorsuch who wrote the opinion for the majority, that don't look now, folks, but the Cherokee and the Creek Indians own most of Oklahoma. And so we'll have to sort that out. So this isn't that we're back to Faulkner. The past isn't dead, it's not even past. African American. 1619, a couple of years ago when I first used this, nobody knew what I was talking about. Everybody now has been reminded. Unless you are descended from a Virginia Cavalier, and you have to keep in mind in 1619, there were only about 2,000 or 3,000 of them, so it'd be a very select subgroup. And African Americans were here before any of your ancestors. The first African Americans were in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. Real quickly, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, W.E.B. Du Bois. Everybody knows who Martin Luther King and Barack Obama are, and we'll be going into that. Or the women's movement. It was, well, women, according to the Naturalization Act of 1790, if they happened to be white and free, they were citizens, but they were only partial citizens. They couldn't vote, and they had almost no legal rights, none whatsoever. They were, in fact, they were in fact the property of their father, and then when they got married, they were the property of their husband. How did the women's movement, the suffragettes, how did Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, how did they fight for women's rights? Well, they used the Declaration. And we'll discover that at the Women's Convention in Seneca Falls in 1848, they wrote a Declaration of Rights and Sentiments that directly mimicked the Declaration of Independence. And of course, freedom's fault lines, there are those who would exclude, who would deny those people their right to be part of this. And they're here. A hustling nation. I said earlier, Jeffersonian economics and Hamiltonian economics. We like to tell ourselves we're small farmers living in small towns and we're happy yeomen. Facts of matter are is we live in Alexander Hamilton's world of industry, banks, and financing. We're a hustling nation of can-do people. Entrepreneurs like Jeff Bezos, or more importantly, Stephen Smith. Stephen Smith's of Pennsylvania. We're going to learn about him. Or Annie Malone, or Ben Franklin, maybe the original entrepreneur. Or Tory Burch, and I'm sure you know who Bill Gates, and we just covered for John D. Rockefeller. But we're a nation of entrepreneurs and yes, you can people. We agree with Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People. Ben Franklin invented the self-improvement industry. But we're also a nation of hustlers with a kind of catch, with a double entendre. P.T. Barnum discovered a long time ago, Americans would love to be transported to worlds of unreality and would pay you if you could do it for them. So from P.T. Barnum to Disney World isn't quite the arc that people would think. And we're going to look at the nation of hustlers and the ongoing fascination with the Godfather and people like the hustler. This is William Thompson, although I have to quickly say there's some controversy of whether or not that's actually the photograph of William Thompson, the con man, from whom the word comes, the confidence man, the con man. But the most important thread in some ways might be the immigrant's tale. We're a nation of immigrants, of people who came from everywhere. And we have spent a lot of time fighting about that. The very first Immigration Act, if you want to call it an Immigration Act, was one that prohibited immigration, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And then there's the Immigration Act of 1924 that tried to stop the influx of Southern and Eastern Europeans in the late 19th and early 20th century. And then probably the most consequential piece of legislation that most people have never heard of or don't understand, the Immigration Act of 1965, which triggered the greatest period of immigration in American history, which is today, or at least the immediate previous 20 to 30 years. There's now, again, just as there was in 24, just as there was in 1882, there are people who want to stop that influx of new Americans. And as I said a while ago, everyone, unless you happen to be a Native American, you are descended from someone who came from somewhere else. It begins at the beginning of the Republic. It goes through the middle of the 19th century when Germans and Irish were told that they need not apply. There was a very heavy anti-Catholic undertone to that because the German immigrants of the middle 19th century were German Catholics. And it's that immigration of the late 19th, early 20th century. This is a Hungarian immigrant. These are Italian immigrants, Russian Jews, Polish immigrants. These people down here are Transylvania Saxons, of which I happen to be one by ancestry. Greek immigrants. And it continues today. The Asian immigrants, Chinese and Japanese immigrants, Bosnian and Eastern European immigrants from the Balkans, South Asian Indian immigrants, and there are South Asian Indian immigrants, and Latino and Mexican and Hispanic immigrants. It continues to today. And just as in the past, there are people who would have kept them out, whether it's Stephen Miller and the current administration, or Charles Davenport, who invented eugenics, or Henry Cabot Lodge Sr. and Prescott Hall, who's hiding behind Ben here on the screen, and the Anti-Immigration League that tried to exclude immigrants. And then lastly, the fusion thread. How do you pull all of that together? We hold these truths. I'm not going to read all of these. This is a great poem by Whitman. We pull all of this together because we have, in spite of ourselves, as John Meacham says in The Soul of America, the history of America is one of tragedy and blood, but it is also one of ever-increasing inclusiveness. Or as Martin Luther King said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And as we'll discover, and this is from September of 2019, they're still coming to America. This is a natural citizenship and naturalization ceremony in the federal courthouse in downtown Erie. And if we had the soundtrack, you'd be hearing Neil Diamond, they're still coming to America. So that's the preview.
Andy, that was a fantastic sprint through that. I know that was asking you to do a lot. And
I'm going to stop sharing, okay, Ben?
Sure, go ahead. And as you're doing that, I can't help but think in that slide you had that one of my favorite poems by Walt Whitman, I Sing of America. And I think too, maybe that's one of the things that really helps us to understand the density of the tapestry, that, it's not just one layer, but perhaps, many layers upon themselves.
Layers and layers and layers.
And I think of the Langston Hughes contribution to that particular part of our story of I Too, and I Too Sing of America, and telling how somebody else views that. I've got to ask Andy, as we're nearing the end, and again, a great job on an overview, and we're looking forward to diving into each one of these. And I'm sure it's something that you'll cover, and perhaps there with the last part, and I don't want to give too much away, the immigrant's tale, maybe that's what makes this different. But is this inherently American? And you know, we're talking about the American Tapestry, but I mean the sense of looking at ourselves and trying to figure out our story. And I guess that's, you know, and if I can say in jest, is there a Dr. Andre Roth in Cannes, France, trying to tell the French tapestry and look at the way that French people might look at their own story and wrestle with that? Is this inherently American, or is this something that we're seeing nations one by one do?
I don't know that it's inherently American. We may, in the last several hundred years, be the preeminent example, but it's really the story of every culture that assimilated other people into it. So is there a Dr. Andre Roth? Perhaps not, but the French are not as homogeneous as people think. I often use the French as an example. You and I could move to France, live there for 60 years, and would never be a Frenchman. You would always be the person who was from somewhere else. In America, at least what we used to like to think is true, and I think still is true, but there are people, different stories, different people. There is no longer agreement necessarily on this. We'd say, hey, you're welcome, and if you buy into several things, the rule of law, for better or worse, the free market economy, the Constitution of the United States, and a couple of other things, you buy into that and agree to it, you're in, okay? There are some people who, of course, would now like to make a much higher bar than that, or maybe make the bar have jagged edges and different qualities. But I think at the moment, it's not necessarily an inherently American story, because I suspect, but I don't know enough about it, you might find something similar in Argentinian culture. For example, in Argentinian culture, most people would think, if you were to say what's the largest ethnic group in Argentina, the knee-jerk reaction would be Spanish, because they speak Spanish, because the Spanish were there first. Largest ethnic group in Argentina are people who are Italian or of Italian ancestry. And it's essentially the people who the Immigration Act of 1924 excluded in America. When they cut Italian immigration, I think like 95%. Well, those people went out. But yeah, I don't think you would find a Japanese asking himself what it means to be Japanese. I could be wrong on that, and I'm quick to say it. So let me change your word inherently American. I don't think it's exclusively an American story, but it is still the American story, because even though we think we're an old culture, 200 years, that's nothing. We're still in the process. We're still in the process of pulling this all together. I made the comment in another context, no one's yet written the American Aeneid. And we could spend some time talking about that in another episode, because the Aeneid is a fantasy meant to justify an emperor who pulled together diverse people. But in any event, those were the previews. Maybe you're going to hope I'm not saying something you were about to say. We're going to do this in the fall and winter, and we'll do each one of those things we went over quickly. We'll give them a more thorough treatment.
And two, one of the new things to add is that, Andy, you're talking about this stuff on WQLN Public Media, in Erie, Pennsylvania, our NPR outlet. You've got a radio show now. Tell us a little bit about that before we sign off here, and look forward to those future episodes here. What can we find on WQLN? When do we need to tune in? And tell us a bit about the radio show process.
Okay, we did actually Sunday, yesterday or 2 days ago, August 9th, we did episode number 1, which is a brief introduction to this, somewhat similar to what we just did, although we did a lot on 1968. But we're going to be doing the American Tapestry Project on WQLN Radio not every Sunday, second Sunday of every month from now through January. The next program airs on Sunday, September 13th. And they are in the process of putting up on their website and on their radio station's website and their podcast website links to these programs. And so sometime in the next several days, you should find on WQLN Radio a link to the program that aired this past Sunday. And it will be the second Sunday of each month through January. We're going to do the whole series on WQLN radio, with the music, by the way.
And that's such a big part of a lot of what you do. So I know we're excited for that, folks. We encourage you to tune in to WQLN to hear Dr. Andrew Roth over there. You can catch past episodes once they're available on WQLN's website, WQLN.org. You can find those there. Andy, I have 1,000 questions. I'm going to save them for our series because I'm looking forward to diving into each one of these threads. Freedom at home and abroad, freedom's fault lines, a nation of hustlers, the immigrant's tale. And I think most importantly, how is this all getting held together? And is there a point in which we might not be held together? I think those are some of the things we're going to get to unpack. I'm looking forward to it. A big thank you for joining us in conversation here for Jefferson Digital Programming.
Well, thank you, Ben. I hope I hope the audience enjoyed it. Thank you.
One of the best that we've got. So glad to be here. Looking forward to unpacking that. And of course, the Jefferson audience, thank all of you for tuning in for this. Whether you're watching live or you're watching a later broadcast of that, we are grateful for you. We can't do what we do without you, the audience, and we look forward to continuing to do this and continuing to unpack this series. Of course, there'll be more information about that to come on our website, www.jeserie.org. But you can also find all of that information on any of our social platforms. You can also find Andrew Roth's book notes on our website as well, plus a whole bevy of other publications that you can check out. And of course, recordings of past productions that we have for Jefferson Digital Programming, including Dr. Roth's look at 1968 compared to 2020, as well as his overview of the 1968 series. All of that and more at the Jefferson website, jeserie.org. And of course, be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Spagan. Be safe, be sound, and thanks for listening and learning with us.